Is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. And Speaker, it's a pleasure to be able to speak on the Appropriations Bill in this chamber and outline some of the issues that the Parliament presently faces at this time. And it gives us a good stock to look at the challenges we face in terms of prudent budget management and making sure that we're appropriating the funds necessary to run a nation against a backdrop of what is unquestionably an incredibly challenging time. We've obviously gone through difficult economic circumstances and environmental circumstances as a result of the drought. There are a lot of communities across the country that have struggled for some time, needing income, security and, of course, access to one of the most important commodities we have, which is water, because it's the lifeblood that enables their crops to grow and for grass to feed their cattle so that they can go on and earn a livelihood and income for them and their community. So many communities have dealt with such a difficult blow as a consequence of the drought. Same is also true as a consequence of the recent bushfires, and I see members in the chamber present who have been on the forefront of that catastrophic event across the eastern seaboard of Australia. And while many of those communities are in the process of rebuilding, many of it will take a long time. Many of those communities have faced devastating consequences where people have lost their lives, their homes and community infrastructure as well as wildlife. And it will take some time, anyone who's been involved with fires, to repair and rebuild. My grandfather and grandmother experienced the consequences of the Ash Wednesday bushfires in the early 1980s in Upper Beaconsfield in Victoria, and knew full well the consequences of bushfires and the impact it can have on communities and the time it takes for them to not just rebuild but to reconnect and re-sow the social fabric that holds those communities together. And then, of course, we have the more recent challenge of the coronavirus. Now, Speaker, I don't think we should underestimate the seriousness of the events that are about to present itself to Australia. While the government has provided outstanding leadership, and I think we really, and it needs to be acknowledged in a bipartisan way, outstanding leadership in confronting the challenges and threats and risks of the coronavirus with strong border protection measures which we can implement because we have strong borders, because we have a government that understands the importance of doing so and not tolerating leakage. We're in a position where we can respond economically because we have a budget which has been determined, the government has been determined to return it to a healthy balance. We have spending under control, and of course we have reassured ourselves with our expert medical health services across the country with the cooperation of the states to make sure that we can provide the assistance that Australians need. But more critically, while it is a health crisis, and it is, it will also cascade into a challenging economic one. And I know there's a lot of discussion about that at the moment amongst the community about how the government should respond. And I've been heartened by the language I hear from the Prime Minister and from the Treasurer, that they're taking prudent, responsible and critically considered approach to how the government should work to reassure small businesses, employees and employers so that throughout any difficult economic times to come, that people can be kept in jobs, that small businesses can trade through and can be central to any economic recovery as a result of the economic consequences of the coronavirus. And I hear a lot of calls out there, Speaker, for short-term or rash stimulus measures without any full consideration. We saw that in the global financial crisis from those opposite, and while there was no doubt some benefit to some aspects of it, in practice it was largely wasteful in comparison to the options available to Australia, because we had higher interest rates which were able to be cut by the Reserve Bank, as well as high mineral prices. We just saw money thrown around for marginal benefit, but of course they baked in extra costs which we still continue to pay, and of course future generations still have to repay. And I see some calls for that sort of broad brush approach again. Similarly, I hear suggestions that we should somehow move forward infrastructure programs, when if you go out into the marketplace, people will already tell you that there are massive capacity constraints with supplies, with labour and with projects that can be brought forward. So that is not a sensible solution either. What is necessary is a targeted approach to make sure that government invests in where it can add the most value, because the practical reality that's going to unfold in the coming weeks, because of consequence, particularly the slowdown of manufacturing in China, is you are going to have Australians who are willing buyers of goods, but suppliers with nothing to sell in some cases, or limited stock in what they can sell. You're going to have service-based businesses that have plenty to sell, but not necessarily the volume of willing customers. Just throwing more money at that problem doesn't solve it. So too, just cutting interest rates doesn't solve it. It has an approach, it can have a marginal effect, but what would be better is if the RBA turned around, rather than cutting interest rates, and looked at the options to help banks loan more money to small and medium businesses so they could trade through the economic challenges to come, and critically to keep people employed so they can keep supporting their families and keep paying their mortgages, to be part of the recovery as a consequence of this temporary crisis ending. But you can only do that, Deputy Speaker, because we have... Sorry, Speaker. You can only do that, Speaker, because we have an economic environment of security and a health environment of security as well. And that's at the heart of what this government's approach has been since the day it has been elected. Now, throughout the speeches of our political opponents, they will wax lyrical about how they could have done things better. With no evidence to justify it, they would have left this country in a weaker spot, with less financial security, less border security, and we would be in a weaker position to respond to this crisis. In the end, that's what government has to provide, is reassurance to the Australian people, because if people are going to back themselves, they need to know they're going to do it in an environment where the government has their back and government is able to deliver them the security that they need to make decisions with confidence. And that's what you get under the Morrison Liberal National Government, and not what you get under the opposition, particularly had they come in at the last election and committed to spend billions of dollars and rake in hundreds of millions of dollars of new taxes. With less money in people's hip pockets, you would need stimulus then, because people wouldn't have any spare cash in their pockets. The other challenge, of course, we face at the moment, Speaker, is in the context of climate change policy. And I see a lot of pronouncements from members opposite about what they think policy should be. I hear the member for Melbourne, the Marxist member for Melbourne, and now leader of the Australian Greens, who comes into this place, and his answer is always to take decisions out of democratic processes and hand it to the United Nations to make determinants about how our policy should be decided. The Independent for Warringah does exactly the same thing as well, undermining confidence in our democracy and our sovereignty. Anybody who thinks the solution to getting stable, considered, ongoing climate policy is to take decisions away from the people who are elected to represent and govern this nation and hand it to the unelected and the unaccountable with scant regard of the human consequences, economic, social, political and environmental, is kidding themselves. So much so that the independent member for Warringah has even recommended imposing unelected, unaccountable bodies to give the green light about whether elected and accountable people, ministers of the Crown and this very parliament, can decide things like emissions targets. That is not a sustainable basis for policy into the future. It's a direct subversion and subjugation of this parliament. And I've no doubt there'll be plenty of people who argue that this is necessary. Clive Hamilton, many years ago, the far-left academic who's got it right on China, I need to clarify, but on not much else, made the argument that maybe we just need to suspend democracy to meet the challenges of climate change. That, of course, will work if you don't have any plan to return to it and or you have no respect or regard for it. And that seems to be the approach the independent member for Warringah has taken. A disregard, not just for this parliament, but let's not misunderstand what that means, a disregard for the people of Australia itself. Because people took these policies to the last election. And last I checked, there were two of them who sat in this chamber. The Labor Party, for clarity, didn't. They took a different idiotic policy, but nonetheless a different policy. And people on this side of the chamber who sit and represent the people of Australia, of the 149 people campaigned on a different platform. But they want the tail to wag the dog, with scant regard for the will of the Australian people, and it needs to be called out. Just like the plan of the opposition needs to be called out as well, because you have the deception of the leader of the opposition going on national television and in this chamber and everywhere else and saying he wants a target by 2050 of zero net emissions. But, by the way, we're still going to export coal. I've never heard such a deceptive statement. It's one designed to manage the different constituent groups inside the Australian Labor Party, but it treats the Australian people as mugs. How on earth could you do that and account for the fugitive emissions that come with it? It is a deception. And if members of the other side want to chortle and laugh because they're either going along with the deception or they're being deceived by it, neither hold them in good regard. The thing we need and we owe the Australian people, whether it's reducing emissions or the coronavirus or any other economic response, is honesty, is trust, to build confidence to take everybody forward together. And what we see from members in the crossbenches and members of the opposition, in clear contrast with this government, is the foundation of our relationship with the Australian people is to take honest plans to the election. It is to take honest plans that we then seek to implement during our term of government. It's an honest plans rather than the deception and dishonesty advocated by our political opponents. And the cost of this is real, their approach. When you go to an election and say one thing and then immediately after do the opposite, it corrodes trust in the very institution and this chamber itself. And I see members on the opposite side nodding, and I'm glad they do, because we show that no clearer than during the previous administration, where you had a Labor Prime Minister say there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, and then came into this chamber and treated the Australian people as mugs and deceived them at the election, and then turned around and voted for it in this chamber. And that is the sort of policy that undermines confidence, long-term confidence, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to deliver sustainable change and to build the trust with the Australian people. It's that dishonesty, and they sit there and they chortle and they laugh at the contempt they have for the Australian people. Well, that is not the view on this side of the chamber. We're going to treat Australians with honesty and build respect and trust, because that is the only way that we can confront the challenges that we face in the short, the medium and the long term. That's why, rather than having a debate about their policies, we're actually delivering substance on how we're going to achieve our targets. That's why we're bringing forward a roadmap to give people an understanding, give Australians an understanding about the choices that this country faces, versus making ambit, empty, dishonest promises to the Australian people, as the Leader of the Opposition and the parrots who sit behind him do as well, who simply represent and repeat the lines that they simply cannot substantiate and back up with hard evidence. Now, the Australian People's Deputy Speaker will judge them at the next election, and should. And some of us will stand up and call out, as we did, about their dishonesty, about their retiree tax and how they said it wouldn't hit people on low incomes, only for the Leader of the Opposition to come in to explain to the Australian people after that it did. Some of us will never give up in making sure we expose the deception of the Australian Labor Party.